Thank you. This is, ladies and gentlemen, this is the program on constitutional government, starting off our spring series with our guest today, who's Tamar Jacoby. Tamar Jacoby is president of Opportunity America, which is a Washington-based nonprofit working to promote economic mobility. She's a former journalist and she's an author. She was senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, senior writer and justice editor at Newsweek, and before that, a deputy editor of the New York Times op-ed page. Her articles have appeared in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Weekly Standard, Foreign Affairs. She's the author of a book, Someone Else's House, America's Unfinished Struggle for Integration, and an edited volume, Reinventing the Melting Pot, The New Immigrants, and What It Means to Be American. And she's Yaley. We always take great pleasure in welcoming a Yaley here. And, so Tamar Jacoby, she's going to talk on restoring the dignity of the working class.
Well, thank you, Harvey, and thank you, all of you, for coming out. Let's see, let me get the mic sorted out here. Yes, as Harvey mentioned, I wasn't sure he would. I attended another New England Ivy League institution, and so it's always nice to be here, if only to size up the competition. And I'm looking forward to the conversation. So I thought before I got started, I would just say a word about me, just so you know kind of the slant that you're getting. Harvey's introduction was very generous. I'm a former journalist and writer who a few years ago went over to the dark side of policy and politics, moved from New York to Washington, and founded a nonprofit. And I've been running, in the last 15 years, it is, I guess, God, how time flies, I've run 2 small independent policy shops in DC. And we kind of exist in the space between research and policy development and politics. And, you know, I do sometimes wonder why I made that switch. I mean, these have to be the decades, certainly of my lifetime, some of the worst decades to be in Washington. Really dysfunctional place. Worst decades to be there trying to influence thoughtful policymaking. And it's not just because of our current president. You know, the politics of Washington our politics have been increasingly dysfunctional over the years, especially if you're someone like me who really believes in bipartisanship. I mean, I'm on the center, I'm on the right, I'm on the center right, but I think, that it's very hard to govern or govern for long without bipartisanship, and that's just been getting harder and harder in Washington. So that's the uphill battle I fight every day for a living. And what I'm going to talk about today is a project that I led over the past 2 years, and there's sort of a volume to prove it, to try to seed some bipartisan thinking about policy to restore dignity and opportunity to the working class. And I'm sorry, I see some of you have your hands cupped around your ears. I'm not really sure what to do about that. Can someone else help me so that or are we okay? Can most of you hear me? Okay, sorry, I apologize. Why the working class? Well, you know, all of you, I'm sure, remember the 2016 election campaign raised questions and shone a light on a problem that I think some of us had a sense for a while that it was brewing in the country. There had been troubling signs there have been a couple of big books and troubling signs for a few years that something was happening with the working class. And I think the biggest way to think about this is that 30, 40 years ago, the working class in America looked pretty much like the middle class, only they earned less. But they, pretty much somebody in every household worked. Couples tended to get married. Kids grew up in families with 2 parents. People went to church, and people were very engaged in their community institutions, more than many other kinds of Americans. The union, the church, the Rotary, what have you. And well, already before 2016, it was pretty apparent that was changing, that the middle class and the working class were diverging, and the working class in many respects was coming to start to look more like the poor. And so, obviously, 2016 focused us all on that in a new way. Not just the fact that the working class wasn't doing as well as it once had, but also that at least some of them were angry about it and felt they'd been left out and neglected and kind of were getting the short end of the stick in America. And so in the wake of the election, my organization, which is really a little tugboat of a policy shop, rallied the two big battleships of policy thinking in DC, AEI and Brookings, to form a group and spend a year considering the working class and its issues. And our goals were to get beyond the campaign rhetoric, check the journalism, there'd been a ton of journalism, check it with research, and propose some bipartisan, our main task for ourselves, propose some bipartisan policy solutions. Because bitterly bipartisan as the country already was 3 years ago, the members of our group, and there's a good list of them, I'm sorry, I don't have that on a slide, but there's a good list of them on the volume. Everyone from names probably known to you, Ron Haskins, Bell Sawhill, Bill Galston, to Robert Doar, now the head of AEI, Orrin Cass, some of you probably read his recent book, great list. But our goal was to get to some bipartisan solutions and also model what that's like, bipartisanship, right? Because our sense around Washington is that people have forgotten how to do that. Bipartisanship doesn't mean a mushy middle. Bipartisan means a principled compromise. And we thought maybe we could show people how that was done, spend some time talking about an issue and come to a compromise. So we started with 16 members, and we were half conservative, half progressive. We worked for a year. We had 8 all-day meetings around a table like this. Deliberations were thoughtful and respectful. We learned a lot, but we also had some knockdown, drag-out fights. By the end, friends were, having harsh conversations with each other, and several people quit. So it wasn't easy, even among a group of 16 people pretty committed to finding an answer together. It was not easy to do it. And in the end, 13 of us signed this, 13 of the 16, and we all have stuff we don't like in it. And as the time goes on, there's stuff I don't like, I like even less. But we agreed that this was a package that perhaps we could agree on, and we put our names to it. And so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about some of the policy proposals. Before I do, let's see if I can get my slides going here. Yes. Okay. So, wait, that's not the right one. There we go. Okay, so to start out, let me talk a little bit about how we define working class. So we wanted to have a group that had a floor and a ceiling. We didn't want to lump what we kind of call the poorest of the poor in with the working class. And we thought that income was important, but in today's world, arguably, education is even more important. So we had 2 dimensions of the definition, and we had a floor and a ceiling for each one. And the bottom line was at least a high school diploma, but less than a 4-year college degree. And between the 20th and 50th income percentiles, which is roughly 30K to 70K for a family of 2 parents and 1 kid. And it turns out nearly 40 million Americans fall in that category. And we're talking about black, white, Latino, Asian, any ethnicity. And that was very important to us, that the definition leave room for that kind of diversity. This was not meant to be a book about the white working class or just Trump voters. It was meant to be a book about the working class. And the way we kind of saw it is that the son of a out-of-work Ohio steelworker and the daughter of a Latina cleaning lady in Los Angeles, don't have exactly the same problems, but they have a lot of the same issues, and we wanted to come up with policy solutions that worked for both of them. And then the last piece of the definition, it's not on the slide, but what we early on came to sort of agree, it's an attribute, not part of the definition, but an attribute, was that as a socioeconomic group, they're kind of the hole in the donut. And what I mean by that is too well off for many of the means-tested benefits that benefit the poorest Americans, but not well enough off for the tax deductions and other kinds of benefits that, for want of a better word, we all benefit from. And those are significant when you start to look at them. Everything from mortgage interest tax deduction to education savings accounts to, down in long list. And as a group, the working class has been hit by a double whammy in recent decades. They've been much harder hit by globalization than the rest of us. For most of us, globalization's been a good thing. For them, it's by and large meant that they lost their jobs, or they earn a lot less, or their jobs have disappeared. And number two, they have the anger that Trump tapped into there's fire there, beneath that smoke. They have been left out by politicians for decades. Again, policy has either favored the poor, and we've done a great job of creating a safety net for the poor, or it's favored the middle class, and the working class is largely, people have basically forgotten about them. So. A few facts about them, again, before I get to policy. Let's see if I can do this. There we go. Where are my facts? So, as I mentioned, a very diverse group. Used to be, 40 years ago, they were about 80% white. Now we're down to 60% white, with about 20% being black and about 20% being Hispanic. Fewer and fewer, and especially of the men, fewer and fewer of them are working. Between 1980 and 2016, the employment rate among men in this group dropped from 81% to 74%, and that's a big drop when you're talking about employment rate. And it's coming back up a little bit in the tight labor market, but it's still not a good number. They rely less on government benefits than the poorest of the poor, but there's still about 15% of them enrolled in Medicaid and about 15% on food stamps. Marriage has declined, these are the two whopper numbers. Marriage has declined more among the working class than among any other group, richer or poorer. And the very poor already started with very low marriage rates. They've been declining, but not as dramatically as for the working class. Middle class, upper middle class people still get married by and large. For the working class, from 1980 to 2016, they've gone from 74%, basically 3/4, to basically half. Right? So 3/4 of working class people used to get married, now have to. And civic engagement is just the other really sad story. As I mentioned earlier, used to be much more engaged than other people. The unions, the church, you name it, the Rotary Club, very engaged. And it's now just the bottom's fallen out. Less than 15% participate in anything. So our product, we have about 36 policy proposals, and I'm going to dig into one area in a minute, but I'm going to talk about make a few general points first. We talk about everything from child care to unions. We sort of cover the water lot, so to speak, ideas about jobs, wages, skills, families, and communities. And the central theme, but in that 36, the central unifying theme is work. And if you had to sort of put these 150 pages, whatever it is, on a bumper sticker, it would basically be, put the work back in working class. And there's sort of four, we thought of that in four ways. One is bring people back into the workforce. Like all these men who've dropping out of the workforce, let's get them back into jobs and working. Number two, work needs to pay. Let's make work pay. That's an issue. It doesn't always pay as it should for the working class today. Number three, and we're getting closer to the ideas closer to my heart, teach people the skills they need to get better jobs, right? I mean, it's one thing to subsidize paychecks, but let's teach people skills so they can get better jobs. And number four, strengthen family and community to support work. And, if there was anything that everyone in the group really agreed upon, this is the kind of area of left-right consensus, it was this idea, wholehearted agreement, no compromise needed, the dignity of work and the importance of work. And we talked a lot about that. And, the point is work as a paycheck, right? I mean, there's an argument that the paycheck should be fatter. I think that's perhaps a valid argument. But work is much more than a paycheck, right? Work is purpose and dignity. There's supporting yourself and your family and making a contribution to your community is a central source of purpose and dignity for most people. Number two, work is an engine, arguably the primary engine of upward mobility. If we want people to have better lives, and especially if we want them to have better lives for their families, work is the way it supports families, and it transmits all those healthy values that are going to help the next generation do better. And so, the bottom line, I mean, and a lot of people are worrying about this now as automation is threatening to, eliminate routine jobs. The bottom line for our group was that a society where fewer people are engaged in productive work and a growing segment is sitting on the sidelines, will not be a healthy or thriving or inclusive society. So, we argued bitterly about the means to get people back to work and about how to get them better paychecks. And we argued a lot of, the how was not such a consensual issue, but there was no doubt and no dissension about the central principle of, kind of work is the answer, the importance and dignity of work. So that's sort of general point number one about the recommendations. General point number two, our recommendations are budget neutral. And, those are really important words in Washington these days, and we were determined to do it. And, we have a lot of ideas about what should change and what should be done, but we managed to, we found a way to pay for everything we propose. And I'm going to give you an example of that in a minute when I get to a specific chapter. Number three, we rejected all the big bumper sticker ideas of the day. We're against universal basic income. We're against free college. We're against Medicare for all. We're against severe immigration restrictions, and we're against a global trade war, right? Like the bumper sticker ideas on both sides we think are bad ideas. Especially, I would argue, universal basic income, for exactly the reason I was just talking about work being central. So yeah, our proposals tend to be, a little wonkier. They don't always fit on bumper stickers, but we think they're more practical and more likely to be effective. Number four, we looked beyond government, right? We do have 36 policy proposals, and we are now trying to find champions to support them in both DC and state government. But we also make recommendations for a lot of other kinds of Americans: employers, unions, churches, community groups, and not least working class men and women. And employers are one of the most important of those groups. It's not easy to motivate employers to do things they're not already doing. And we thought long and hard and had a lot of debates about how to motivate employers. I'm happy to talk more about that in the question and answer if you're interested. But the point is, the answer isn't just big government, right? And we had a lot of Democrats in the group who wanted the answer to be big government, but we certainly are not arguing for a massive expansion of government. This is going to take the public and private sectors and civil society and everybody working in the same direction. Number five, and in Washington, people like a little bit of a look behind the curtain. You guys may not care less, but both right and left made concessions, right, to get to bipartisanship. And so what were the areas? Well, one of our biggest area of clash, it's crazy, was work requirements for social programs, right? So we're talking about SNAP, Medicaid, potentially, TANF, there are work requirements in TANF, but should we strengthen them? And everybody in the group, and we had a lot of people in the group who were sort of former Clinton, Bill Clinton people who, were part of welfare reform that added work requirements. So we didn't think this was going to be that hard. But, literally there was blood on the floor over work requirements. I still have the scars of the phone calls and what have you. And everybody in the group agreed that the agencies that administer these benefits in the states and the cities should be doing more to get people into jobs, that they should see that as their job, so to speak. And, we're not just handing you the check, we're helping you get a job. And they don't necessarily do that now. And so even the Ds were willing to agree that that was a good idea. The Republicans in the group, we conservatives in the group, wanted to make work requirements for individuals. If you don't work, maybe you don't get the benefit. And, that's a little trickier when it's food stamps and Medicaid than when it's welfare, cash benefit. But it's still, we argue that within limits that there should be a work requirement. Democrats gave a little. They gave, we have some mushy language in there on work requirements. Republican side, we gave a little bit on taxes. And, not everybody wanted to. It was difficult. We wanted the thing to be budget neutral. But, we wanted it to be budget neutral. And the point is we did add some programs. Most of the ways we paid for things were not with taxes. Mostly we paid for things by finding money elsewhere, but we came up a little short on some things. And so the Republicans in the group gave a little on mostly taxing, closing loopholes for the higher end taxpayers, wealth tax, some tax deductions. It was not easy, but that's where we gave. So one last thing, and then I'll get to a little more specific set of proposals, is, the theme that really runs through the report, and I will come back to this when I get to the specifics, we did agree that the working class needs a better deal, that the neglect of the past 3 or 4 decades where policymakers have really helped everybody but them, that's not right, and that we need to think about how to change that. So the part I'm going to dig into, the chapter that I wrote and that really means the most to me, is our proposals on education and skills. And because our group really believes that nothing would do more to expand opportunity for the working class than more of the right kind of education and skills. And this isn't usually too controversial in most rooms, but I'm realizing it may be controversial here. Our shared assumption, and there was really no dispute about this around the table, was that what the working class needs is a true alternative to four-year college, right? That the college for all message that this country's been sending for really the past 2 or 3 decades is helping a lot of people, but it's not helping many people, and we need a true alternative. And don't get me wrong, if you finish college is a huge boon. One recent estimate suggests a 65% earnings premium for people who finish college, right? That's a big number. But many students don't finish. I mean, you wouldn't know it on the streets of this city, but only about 1/3 of Americans have bachelor's degrees, right? Everybody wants to go to college, and many do, but only 1/3 of adults have bachelor's degrees. And the problem is kids who don't finish, kids who study the wrong thing, the wrong majors really, can be disastrous. And of course, students who take out big loans, those people end up worse off than if they hadn't started a 4-year college. And this is a problem across America, right? Americans of all income brackets are starting to question, is 4-year college worth it? But for the working class, it's a particular need to have a true alternative for 2 reasons. One is if you're the kind of person whose father had a good life and made a good living and supported a family with a high school diploma or less, you can't do that anymore. Like, you can't really pull that off. Everybody needs something now in addition to high school, some kind of post-secondary qualification. But if it isn't going to be college, what is it? And number 2, people who lose their factory jobs at 32 or 38 or 42, and we're increasingly seeing that, right? Automation and globalization. They do need to go back and get some kind of skill. They need to retool, but they are not going to go back even for 2 years, right? And sit in class and learn how to divide and multiply and do English and take history again, So both of these circumstances, which are where the working class is, really need a true alternative. Now, there is some good news in this field. There's a lot of ferment in America now around the alternatives. It's been sort of career education has been kind of the hot, idea in education reform for, coming on 10 years. And there's a lot of experimentation. There's new programs and new connections between programs and new kinds of credentials. And it's a very exciting field. But my metaphor is that's kind of Silicon Valley in the 1970s or 80s. There's a garage on every corner. There's a lot of experimentation, but we're not really quite there yet as a nation. We don't have that iPhone, or not everybody has accepted it. And so that's the challenge that we as a group try to address in our education and skills chapter, is how do we use policy to spur the emergence of a true alternative to 4-year college? And we have a lot of ideas. We have ideas for educators and employers and federal government and state government. But our most dramatic proposal, surprise, surprise, has to do with money. And it's about federal spending on higher education. And our point about federal spending on higher education is that it isn't keeping up with all that exciting ferment out there, right? You got a garage on every corner, you got people experimenting, but there's not enough money for it. And the numbers are pretty stark. Let's see if I can get my slides going here. Okay. So the U.S. spends $140 billion a year on post-secondary education. That's a biggie. That's the big number. But $120 billion of it goes to traditional academic higher education. A mere $19 billion, when you put all the programs together, goes to what you would call occupational education. That's not to a 4-year degree. And that's 14%. And I don't know what the balance should be. I'm not sure it should be 50-50, but it definitely shouldn't be 1486, right? And so our group, proposed to change this. And we said there should be more federal financial aid available. Money is not the only thing to fix this. There have to be good programs and there's experimentation, but what the feds can do is money. And so what we propose is that this should be rebalanced to some degree, more money for occupational career-focused programs. And the point is, in and of itself, that's an idea that makes sense to a lot of people. I can even see you guys nodding. 1486 doesn't sound right. They're two hard questions. One is quality control, right? Because you don't want to just start handing out money and have another for-profit college debacle, right? You got to think about how you're going to have quality assurance around these programs. And the other thing is, where are we going to find the money? And I'm happy to talk about the quality assurance in a second. That's what I spend a lot of my time thinking about. But for our purposes of my next few minutes, I'm just going to talk about where we found the money. And in the end, our proposals were informed by the imbalance I talked about earlier, right? That for 2 generations, maybe more, policymakers have been helping every group except the working class. And there's a lot of help for people at the bottom of the income scale and a lot of help for those of us at the top of the income scale, but not that much for people in the middle. And so we do some redistribution of federal education benefits. And we basically do it by taking money from 3 pots of higher ed spending that now go primarily to middle class and upper middle class families. And before I list them, I'll just say in most rooms they are not controversial. And in our group they were not controversial. I mean, it was really one of the least controversial chapters, but they may strike some of you as radical. So we eliminate 529 education savings accounts. And the story about 529s is that almost all 529s go to upper middle class families. The families in the top fifth of the income ladder reap 97% of the benefit of 529s, right? So while poor and working class families basically see no benefit, so we get rid of them. Number 2, I might be getting more controversial for this group. We eliminate loan forgiveness for graduate students. Graduate students, not loans, but loan forgiveness. Graduate students already have bachelor's degrees. They can take those bachelor's degrees to a bank. That's collateral. They already proved they can learn and earn. Most, especially the biggest borrowers, people in the biggest borrowers for graduate student loans are people going to medical school and law school, and they borrow up to $500,000. There was an article not too long ago in the Wall Street Journal about the $1 million borrower club. They're elite professionals at elite professional schools heading for elite professional degrees. They can go to banks, or borrow in the private market. The taxpayer shouldn't be subsidizing them. So, and then number 3, we also make an adjustment to undergraduate education credits. They too benefit primarily better off families, and families up to $180K a year can get tax benefits. Research shows that tax benefits do nothing to increase college going. It's just a subsidy to the middle class. And so we lower that threshold from 180 to 100. So, what we think that each of these proposals will eliminate an upper middle class subsidy, but preserve aid for the middle class and the working class and below. And together, we think they'd free up a lot of money for job-focused education. And, to come back to our theme, dignity, we think they would help a lot of working class Americans tap into the dignity of work. Partly sort of obvious reason, the more skilled you are, the better your job, the better pay, the more rewarding, the more dignity. But it's also really important for those, again, growing group of people who lose their jobs in their mid-20s, late 20s, early 30s, late 30s. People who, especially men, right, who had a factory job that was paying $25 an hour, lose that job. All things being equal, would go back to work, but the jobs that are available are $9 jobs at Wendy's, right? It starts to look much less appealing to go back to work. And our hope is that the answer for that guy is enhanced skills, right? Give him a skill so he can get $20, $25 an hour job and stay in the workforce. So I'm coming about out of time, and what I'm going to do in closing, I don't usually do this. I'm going to end with a question and a photograph. So I don't usually end my talks with questions. I usually end my talks with "do this" or "this is the truth" or something. But today I'm going to end with a question, and because it's sort of interesting. We finished this project 3 or 4 months ago. And since then, my certainty, my sense that we'd sort of gotten to the bottom of the problem and sewn up all the answers, has been giving way to some questions. And I think that's a good thing. But one of the big questions is really about class consciousness. So, we as kind of researchers have decided there's a group called the working class, and President Trump and the media, decided in 2016 there was a group called the working class. But what I've started to wonder is, how class conscious is the working class in America today? I don't really know. And do a significant number of people think of themselves as working class? I mean, you see some polling where, a third of Americans say they are, but that's because they are given 3 answers and they pick that one. And, should we be encouraging that, right? That's a hard question. And AI scholar Michael Strain, who I gather is going to come here later in the spring, who's a good friend and who I respect a lot, and who did not participate in the group, he wrote a piece after we published the book saying that, warning people not to treat, sort of reaction to our project, saying don't treat the working class as helpless. Don't, as he put it in this quote, feed them a narrative of victimhood and grievance. And, that resonated with me. I think narratives of victimhood and grievance are poisonous. And that certainly wasn't what we intended with the project. I don't think we're wrong that the working class is the hole in the donut and been hit by this double whammy of industrialization and political neglect. And I think we as a nation should be remedying that. But and we also point out quite a lot in the report that ultimately it's the working class themselves that have to solve their problems, right? They're the ones who have to learn the new skills. We can find the money, but they've got to go back to school. They have to go back to work. They have to form stable families. They have to reimagine and recreate their community institutions. No one can do that for them, and I think we make that clear in the paper, in the book. But Michael's point is important, and I've been wrestling with it since he wrote the piece, and so I just thought I would put it on the table as something that we might talk about. And then the last thing I want to do is I want to end with a photograph. So why a photograph? Well, I'm a former journalist, right? And I sometimes say recovering journalist. But it troubled me all along in this project to be talking about kind of a faceless they. And, we as a group made an effort to get beyond the data and to get out, and meet actually individuals. We did several site visits. We did a listening tour when we were finished. But it's hard to meet ordinary people. We never sat around anyone's kitchen table. And one of the reasons I think this perplexed me, this would be true in any, data-driven paper, is that I think many, if not most of us, operate with fairly stereotypical understanding of the working class, right? And there are kind of 3 leading stereotypes. One is the iconic image of the 1940s and 1950s, the steel worker, the coal miner, Rosie the Riveter, whoever you kind of have in mind. That's obviously not that valid anymore. The second big stereotype a lot of us have is the picture that J.D. Vance paints in Hillbilly Elegy, which is basically a dysfunctional family of Appalachian country people who've come to a collapsing city and, can't really figure out how to handle it. And then the third, stereotype, which is totally different, is a Trump voter, right? And I think, we all have some mix of those stereotypes. And, the data in the report and our conversations, I think, raised questions about how valid all of them were. But, still we didn't really have, we were talking about numbers, we didn't really have a picture to put in its place. And so, of course there is no single picture, right? But a few months after that, or that report kind of went to the press, I did a series of site visits for another project. And I was visiting about a half a dozen small machining shops in the kind of Pittsburgh, Akron area, mostly talking to employers about credentials, but I met a lot of workers. And I couldn't shake my sense that the people I was meeting in these little plants, I'd never seen a photograph that looked like them. So on one hand, I'm sort of looking for the picture, and then I start meeting these guys, and I've never seen a picture that really looks like them. And so I came home, and I searched the web, and this was about as close as I could get. They all have, funny facial hair, and they all have tattoos, and, this was sort of a quintessential guy. And, of course, this is just one guy. He does not capture 40 million working-class Americans. J.D. Vance's family is still out there. And, there are a lot of Trump voters still out there, people like that. There's a lot of Latina women working in pink-collar jobs, and others, and others, and others. This guy is not the face of the working class. He's just one face. But what's important to me is that he is a face, and he isn't just a data point. And I'll end there. I look forward to the conversation. All right. I'm going to sit down for the conversation, so let's see if I can make the mic work. So do you feel this, or do I?
Whichever. You want to go?
Sure. Okay, sir. Please tell me who you are if you don't mind.
I'm Tom Palmer, a former journalist, actually. So would you just define briefly the middle class, and is there an overlap between middle class and working class?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think for the purposes of, there are many different ways to define it, right? And there are many different papers and many different scholars. I think the way we thought of it, was they would be the next tier up. So that would be, if this group ends at $70K for a family of two with a kid. I don't know what the top of the middle class is, but that would be the place where the middle class would start. Maybe in some typology there's only four, poor, working class, but no, there's a group in there in upper middle class. I don't know. We didn't fill out the whole chart.
But they don't overlap.
But not well. I mean, they probably do overlap a little bit. I mean, I think that gets to my last point. How many people? How do people think of themselves? If you're a welder married to a nurse, you're probably earning, 150, right? And so they don't really fall in my group. But you probably don't, do you have who in that does anyone in that family have a 4-year degree? Maybe not. So I mean, I don't think we're talking about the periodic table, for want of a better word. I think it's a little more complicated. That helps. Yes, ma'am.
Well, first, I think this is a wonderful project.
Thank
and
you.
Power to you and your group and your foundation, your organization. I have so many questions, but I won't ask all of them. I'm a little puzzled by, yes, work. It's good to have a word that you can sort of pin everything on, but what kind of work? In other words, it's nice to talk about we have to give people skills, but what kind of skills actually are going to match the jobs that are likely to be around in 20 years if something else isn't done as well? So, so you can be working, but it can be in a place in an industry that's going to move someplace else, breaking up your own sense of community. It's going to have a very temporary feel. It's going to be without benefits. What is there research on? And of course, how can predict? But given computerization, given the kind of WeWork phenomenon where everybody just sort of rents out a little cubicle and everybody's a self-employed person with no, kind of patching things together, if that's the new work, and that's what a lot of the millennials seem to be saying, is facing them, what skills would make sense, especially for 40-year-olds out of the job? It's not like everybody can be a welder. So isn't it? It's a little bit abstract.
Yeah, so a lot of people think about that now, sort of the
Yeah.
good jobs conversation, the future of work conversation. I would say that's about what I spend, most of my time is in meetings thinking about that. And of course, people don't really know what's coming, right? And the truth is about the people working, the autonomous workers, the WeWork kind of people and the Uber, that actually hasn't grown, in recent decades. People think it has, but it hasn't. And who knows what will happen. But I think the key to that is you want people that can, I think on the group, the first thing is I would say in the group, I think D's and R's are a little bit divided. D's, you always want to say a good job, a well-paying job, a middle-class income job. And R's sort of say any kind of work is better than no work. And just like getting to work and having the dignity of a job and getting some kind of paycheck, that's better than not working at all. I think that's a fair way to summarize the divide.
Slave
But
labor.
That's why I think about skills. And the real division between kind of the new career education, for want of a better word, and the old voc ed is that the new career education can't, everybody kind of has the same principle, it can't be done without employers involved. So you're training to real jobs. So you're never, in the old days, you might go to voc ed and you might learn cosmetology, even though there were no good cosmetology jobs available in your town and cosmetology wasn't paying very much. Now, career ed, if there isn't an employer there saying, I'm going to hire that kid when he gets out and here are the skills I need, it doesn't happen very much.
Does the German apprentice system serve
Well,
as any
again,
kind
the
of
German
model?
apprentice system
Yeah.
is one model. It's a long conversation about
Right,
career education,
right,
right?
right.
But just to stick maybe to the future of jobs. The other piece is what a lot of people need to learn is sort of how to learn and skills that aren't necessarily the technical skills. So, if you think about what happened in a factory, the Ford factory of 20 years ago, basically what, your father's job, he went to the Ford factory and he did a routinized thing that he did all day long, and it didn't take any skill. He got a good paycheck because of the power of the union. It wasn't about a return to a skill. Today, in an advanced manufacturing job, you're working on a $3 million machine, and if you make a mistake, you break it, number one. And number two, your job isn't just to put the widget on, it's to problem solve, and it's to program the robots, and it's a very different kind of work. So teaching people some of those things that people call social emotional skills, it's not quite the right term, but some of those skills that have to do with learning to learn and learning agency and learning responsibility and learning teamwork and yes, you learn the welding, but the welding is not the most important thing you're learning. The most important thing you're learning is being in a team and problem solving. And almost every industry now, you sort of, I read the same stories over and over. You hear the same phrase again and again. We don't need pilots. We need decision makers who know how to fly planes. And so a lot of what real good skills education is about some of those other skills with the technical skills to go with it that are at least going to be in demand in the next 5 or 10 years, but also teaching people that learn how to learn piece. But we can come back to
Yeah.
that. Yes, behind you.
Thanks for your talk, and I wanted to ask you a question about software that makes less skilled workers more productive. So an example could be the ride-sharing services, that it wouldn't be like having to learn to work on a $3 million machine. Did your group give much thought to opportunities that come from innovation?
Yeah, we did not get that granular on any of these topics, I would say. This was definitely 60K foot exercise. I think that's, I think a lot about that stuff, but the group as a whole did not. And I think that's, I think the way, my reaction to your question is, it shouldn't be a hard lift to get people to the point where working on a $3 million machine and not making mistakes is what you ask. I think that's something we can teach people. And so yes, it's true that the robots, for want of a better word, are going to hit this group the hardest, because they're going to hit all of us eventually in some way. But I think this group, a lot of them are doing routinized jobs, routine jobs, and they're going to be hit hardest. The question is what kinds of jobs are going to replace them over time as demand grows as things get cheaper and demand grows. Is it going to be like the Industrial Revolution, where in the end it was good for the greatest number? I think there are pessimists and optimists on that front. I think no matter whether you're a pessimist or an optimist,
I should probably
it's
the question.
well, just let me finish that sentence. Whether you're a pessimist or optimist, I think the transition's going to be hard. But I think it is about creating an educational kind of structure where people can come back, get skills, when they need new skills, can come back easily again the second time. It shouldn't be one and done at 18 to 22. You should be able to come back later and get new skills. But so, yeah.
So I guess I would just reframe the question slightly, since you were saying that your group didn't look so specifically at that, but you've been interested in this question.
Yeah.
So if we know that technology has made certain jobs no longer necessary, so the automation of certain processes that make the assembly line no longer necessary. But on the other hand, the technology, let's say GPS, that made ride-sharing services possible has created new jobs. One might argue that one doesn't have to be either a pessimist exactly or an optimist, but could think about ways in which we can look toward um, jobs being possible for people with fewer skills that still come from advances in technology. So I'm curious to ask you about your
No, I think that's
perspective
right. I
on
think that's right. There's a interesting guy here up actually at Boston College who writes about what happens with ATMs. So everyone thought ATMs, were going to throw millions of people out of work. And what turned out, what happened with ATMs was consumer banking got to be, there was actually more demand for more branches. And once you were done with the ATM, people wanted to go talk to someone. And actually teller jobs have not declined since the ATM, or at least when this guy wrote his book. They may have declined since. There've been more. And Uber is maybe a similar thing. GPS has made new jobs. And I think the way I think about that, the sort of simplest way to think about that is as it gets cheaper, there are new jobs created, but also as it gets cheaper to produce certain things, there gets to be more demand for them, right? Like not that many people used to take taxis. Now a lot of people want to take Ubers. So suddenly there's a hugely expanded demand for the thing that technology made cheaper. And I think that's going to happen in a variety of fields. I think a lot of people are going to lose their jobs, right? And a lot of people are going to have to lose their jobs and have to learn a new skill for another job. It's not just going to be fine. But I think you're right. I think there are ways in which there's ways to be hopeful about, or look for ways to make it work. Make society still work. That the vision of what's really popular in Silicon Valley is the notion of universal basic income. That most people are not going to have jobs, and we should just pay everyone some money to sit at home. And that's if you had to give us one really polemical position in our group, it's we think that's a bad idea. Any kind of work is better than that. Yes.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. So I'm absolutely persuaded that work is at the core of the problem. And I'm also persuaded that retraining or giving people relevant skills is the only realistic solution. But I'm thinking about 2016, where it seemed like you had two candidates, one on the right and one on the left, whose major pitch was not that, but was just, we'll bring back jobs.
Yeah.
And so we'll reverse the trend of globalization somehow by adjusting trade deals or whatever. And then you did have one candidate, Hillary, who suggested something like a retraining program or a kind of apprenticeship program, which didn't seem to be particularly persuasive. And that suggests to me that there's some sense in which these kinds of industries, like coal, say, or like these kinds of factory jobs in the Rust Belt, it seems like these industries themselves actually functioned as civic institutions. And I wonder to what extent you can persuade people to just dispense with those industries which they have such a kind of vested.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think coal mining. You're right. You go to Eastern Kentucky, and I did have the privilege of having an amazing trip in Eastern Kentucky recently. And those people, they weren't just coal miners as a job; they were coal miners as religion. It was completely as an identity, and the whole region was coal mining by identity. And they're struggling now to think about what else they're going to do. And but there are efforts to, there are exciting little pockets of kind of resurgence there. Coal mining is, Trump can bring it back a little bit. It's not going to come back seriously. Manufacturing, on the other hand, we're never going to be a manufacturing country the way we were in the 50s, but we could be a serious advanced manufacturing country up to some point. And so, I think that the economics is not something for policy to decide. I'm strongly against that. I think that's about the markets do what the markets are going to do, and you don't try to do what the candidates promised to do to bring back the golden age or to reverse the economics. I think it's a crazy idea that we're trying to create industries that are not going to be profitable and what have you, or retain industries. The joke about the cars is. It's not a joke. Black humor in these fields. But, we can have protection. There's a reason why people would rather have Mercedes and BMWs than American cars, right? And, we can do all we want to keep out the Mercedes and the BMWs, but that will just make our cars less competitive over time. And, over the long run, it's really a zero-sum game. But so I don't think you can have a policy that's about preserving those industries. I think you do have to help people move away from that sense and learn how to do something else. About politicians talking about retraining, it's hard to talk about it in a way that's compelling, right? It's always going to be a boring topic. It's a process topic. It's like no one wants to hear about retraining. The exciting thing about retraining is it is getting a lot better. There's a lot of pockets of innovation all around the country. A lot of it's happening at community colleges. Go down to Bunker Hill Community College near here. Really exciting programs. And they are sometimes for people that are going to go for 2 years, and sometimes just for people who are going to come for 13 weeks and learn how to do the thing. And there's a partnership with an employer, and then they go to work for the employer. the question of where are people going to belong, and what are going, where are people going to find meaning, and what's their identity going to be? I don't know that's, I think that's a much harder question and a very important question, but I don't think the answer is to pretend, well, it's going to still be coal mining. I think that's, of all the questions in our group that we tasseled with, that was really the hardest, and at least, policy's in at least good position to do anything about. But, again, another example of stuff going on out in America. I was just in Iowa, and Iowa is one of those states. There are 3 million people in Iowa, like in the whole state of Iowa, and they've been losing population for a long time. And the hard part is, how do we keep? And they love their little towns. We have these little small Iowa towns. How do we keep the character? And there's a lot of interesting stuff going on where they are revitalizing those towns with tech jobs, but also kind of cultural things. A brewery that people really like, where they play music, and a little gallery, and it's not the church or the Rotary or the Union, but there are people across America, trying to work on alternatives on that stuff too. Yes, sir.
My name is Ross Terrell, Fairbanks Centre. By the way, the coal miners losing their jobs could go to Australia or China. Both countries are expanding their coal industry significantly and intend to go on doing so. Your theme of work is central is very interesting in the light of the history of the left's political theories, starting in the 19th century when the working class tried to form a party or join a liberal party or whatever. So William Morris, Owen, and Karl Marx himself said with communism you'll be able to go fishing in the morning and write poetry in the afternoon. That's not work.
Yeah.
So has the dream of the left to defeat work come to an end?
That's a really good question. What a thoughtful question. This is why I come to Harvard, right? Nobody ever has asked that. I don't know. In our group, it certainly had. I would say there's a thoughtful group of D's and R's, not just in sort of my seminar room, but Washington generally and more broadly, where everybody does kind of agree work is the answer. Are there still some people who think not? That's a good question. The universal basic income, I think, is that maybe those are the people left over from the Marxist tradition. Silicon Valley is, UBI is the hottest idea in Silicon Valley. That's what passes for politics. And that is basically, the government's going to pay you a little bit, and if you happen to be lucky enough to get a job, good for you, but if not, you'll be fine. And so I think the answer is no, it's not dead. The good news is there's some people on the left who know better, and it will be increasingly, I think, a debate as more people lose their jobs.
Even Charles Murray.
Even Charles Murray.
Technology could be their ally, however.
Indeed.
You
Well,
said
that's indeed.
robots will hit us all. Well, robots are going to hit work too.
Well, no, exactly. But and this is again, I think, what united our group. Our strongest position really. We don't think that's a better answer. I don't think it's going to be better when all of us are thoughtful and engaged and doing work that we feel dignified for, and other people feel basically useless, and they get their little check and they lead their meager existence. We don't think that's going to be better. Yes, sir.
Yes, on that point of the dignity of work, the discussions I read about this and political commentary seems to think that the dignity of work comes from having a paycheck and being able to bring it home and help your family. Whereas, I don't know if you've seen this new book by David Graeber on bullshit jobs.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people out there doing bullshit jobs, but it seems to me that, and we train a lot of them here at this university, and they're in bureaucracies. They know perfectly well they're not helping anybody. They're making things worse, and they know that. And they're just making their bureaucracies worse. Whereas the working class, as described, could actually have jobs that are dignified in another sense, that is, jobs that help other people.
Right.
I'm not talking about kind of altruistic jobs or NGOs or something like that. I'm talking about an electrician who comes to your house and fixes something, and you're happy with him, or just finding an electrician. Right. And there are huge numbers of these jobs that are, well, there's a huge demand, as you probably, I'm sure you know very well, for electricians and carpenters and people who build stuff. And many of these people are also technologically sophisticated, because in order to repair the furnace at somebody's house, you have to understand the computer program. And I wonder how much, I mean, of this federal money, granted that most federal money is negative utility, but if you were to redistribute money around the curve and take it away perhaps from universities, which waste a huge amount of it, and give it to people who want training in things like carpentry and electricians and pipe fitting and all those kind of jobs.
Healthcare jobs.
Wouldn't that sort
Yeah,
of
that's
increase the
that's kind of
happiness
our
of the
view.
working class in
That's-
addition to just the paycheck?
Yeah, that's kind of our view. That's sort of what we're arguing for. I mean, I think a lot. I think people do give a lot of thought to what's a good job, and I think that cert polling data, who trusts it, but. I think it does have to do with money, but I do think it has to do with I have a purpose, and I have a purpose in a group. The famous research on what makes men fight wars. It's about being part of a, and you're helping people. But I mean, I think even the bullshit jobs, that you're talking about, the bureaucrats that maybe aren't helping, I think there too, people often do get a sense of purpose, and I'm holding up part of a team, and I'm doing something that I think is useful. So I mean, I don't valorize one and totally devalue the other. I think we need both. We need smart white collar people and we need blue collar people. But I do think that the balance is out of whack. So I'm basically agreeing with you, but I'm glossing it a little bit.
We tend to evaluate jobs on salary, and that's the way policy people think generally. Is what's your take-home pay, and not on these other measures of satisfaction.
And I mean, I think it would be hard to. I think everybody cares about what the pay they take home, right?
Yeah, sure.
And I don't know that you could put into policy. It'd be hard to legislate around. Do the people feel they're getting purpose out of their jobs? But I just think we could think more about education for jobs as opposed to education for academic purposes. Not that I don't think people should read Machiavelli and Tocqueville and stuff like that. I do.
Well, we should have less Machiavelli, actually.
Yes, sir.
Good
My
Machiavelli.
question has a premise, and if my premise is wrong, then you can disabuse me. I have a broad sense that the job market is much better for jobs that have been characterized as women's jobs than men's. I mean, they're welders, and I understand that, but that the jobs that often seem to me most resistant. Oh, I'm Mark Landy from Political Science at Boston College. I don't know this ATM guy.
Jim Besson.
Jim, but I don't know.
Okay.
That the job future for a lot of jobs that have traditionally been considered women's work is better than for men, more resistant, because it's service, right? It's all these things connected to healthcare and yoga instructors or what have you. Has there been any thought about how to, and I think men are resistant to going into these lines of work. I wish somehow the term nurse could be
degendered.
You could have a euphemism for physicians, whatever. And so there is some of that. But has thought been gone into how to attract men to these, I think some of those pink collar jobs?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I mean, let's not exaggerate. It's not, they're not the only jobs. There are plenty of male jobs too, trades, manufacturing. I mean, and they should, and people want women to go into those jobs, right? The goal all around is diversity in both. But it is a particular problem. Healthcare jobs are, the top 10 growing jobs, top 20 growing jobs, half of them are healthcare. And they're good healthcare jobs, but there's also personal care aid and all those jobs. And it is hard to attract men, and people have given it thought. I don't know that anyone's come up with great answers. One of the additional problems that people don't talk about is often those jobs don't pay that well, like certified nursing assistant and PCT, patient care technician, they call them. And the money's basically held down by what Medicare and Medicaid reimbursement rates are. So one step would be to make them pay better. But I don't I don't think people have come up with a good answer to fixing that gender thing, and I don't think people have really come up with good answers to getting women attracting women to welding and the construction trades. I mean, it's people are men and women are women, and it is hard to cross those lines. Yes, in the back, there are lots of people. It's hard to know where to go. While we're talking gender, let's go for a woman.
Sure, okay. My name is Martha Rice Martini. I'm a retired attorney, and I was interested in if you had any breakdown between men and women in your study. I noted the collapse of the percentage of those who were married, and I also noted 15% who were still active in community affairs. I'm guessing a large part of that 15% active in some kind of community affairs are women. I'm also guessing that a lot of the working class women that you talk about are supporting children at home. I'm guessing they're single mothers, and I'm guessing that a lot of the working class men are unmarried. And that sort of ties in with several themes. What are they working for?
Right.
If not to support a family? That's
Yeah, great question. So we did not break down haven't seen data on community participation by men or women. There's no question, I mean, and this is sort of, again, a pretty fraught research question with some differences on the right and the left. You know, traditionally, when you're talking about the working class, as when you talk about the poorest of the poor, you know, the left tends to think the problem is economics, and the right tends to think the problem is culture, right? And that's true when you're talking about, you know, inner city poverty, and it also came up a lot in our group. We sort of agreed, in a way, the virtue of the bipartisanship was we decided not to decide that, and we have remedies that touch both. But when you come to what's the dynamic of gender and collapsing marriage in working class communities, you know, there is a view that it was the men, you know, if you used to have a $25 an hour job at the factory and you were the breadwinner and you had the authority that came with that and the authority that came with, you know, sort of older values about gender, that was sort of what held the families together, the combination of the two. And that as the $25 jobs disappeared, I mean, you know, China shock, a lot of factories moved overseas, a lot of factory jobs disappeared, and people had the choice of that, you know, lost the $25 an hour job, and the choice was $9 an hour job, you know, or stay at home and my girlfriend will support me. Stay at home and my girlfriend will support me, and get a little Medicaid here and a little food stamps there, started to feel a lot more attractive. And at the same time, women were getting jobs and going to work, and women's labor force participation was rising, and that the sort of combination of the economic shock and the changing values is kind of what hit. Now, other people disagree. I mean, I've argued with Charles Murray about this on his stage, and he kind of says it's all culture, you know, it was all happening before the jobs disappeared. So, I mean, nobody has a really clear sense of the causality. You know, I don't think the causalities, anybody's really worked it out really clearly. But to me, it's got to be some combination. And you have seen, again, it's getting a little better in the tight labor market, but there has just been this disastrous dropping out of the labor force among working class men. Female labor force participation has plateaued. You know, it was sharply rising, you know, sort of through our generation, and now has plateaued. And so that's not, people are worried about that too. But I think a lot of what you are seeing is women working, raising families, having a hard time doing it. But, you know, not universally, but a lot. Yes, sir.
Going back to your question as to whether there is a working class, in your picture, in the 60s when I was in college, I worked in a smelter, I worked construction, I worked bus driving, and there were a lot of conversations at lunchtime and so forth. I never ever heard anyone refer to themselves as a member of the working class. They always talked about working guys. They were all men. They talked, a working guy cannot get a break. And the last politician who really cared about working guy was X, Y, and Z. So I think there was a concept which was alien to them. But my question actually is slightly different. You mentioned something about the role of business in all of this, and you haven't really talked much about it. And I'm wondering if you don't run into, for the last 40 years, there's been this concept that corporations exist only for the purpose of increasing shareholder value. And therefore, there shouldn't be any expenditures for anything else, nor should one gratuitously increase wages if it doesn't further shareholder value. So what was your group, what did you come up with in terms of what might be the responsibilities of business?
Yeah, really good question. So just one thing about the working guys. We did think at one point, I went out and I travel a lot, I see a lot of real people, and I came back and I said to the group, maybe we should think about calling them working Americans rather than working class. Most Americans don't think of themselves as being in any class, and maybe working Americans would go over better. And people in the group really didn't like it. People in the group thought it was sort of euphemism and I don't know what, so we didn't do it. But I had that same instinct, maybe skip the class word. Business. So we do explicitly kind of make the case that you just put forward that said, shareholders are not your only stakeholders that matter, and the people who work for you should matter too. I think that business, and how it involved businesses in training is really, really important, and training is really my area. But it's not that useful when they do it out of a sense of corporate social responsibility. When they do it out of a sense of corporate social responsibility, they do it kind of half-assed, and they don't really care about the quality, and it's not usually pretty short-lived, and it's much more effective when they do it because they need the trained workers. And I think the way to get business engaged in a lot of this stuff is to realize that it's in their interest to have more skilled workers, to have workers they retain longer, to have communities that hold together, to have customers that like them. And so the trick and we had a lot of debate around the table. Basically, the way I characterize it is, should we go with pitchforks, or should we create incentives for them? I mean, I think it's not quite pitchforks and it's limited tax. I don't think the government should be subsidizing all of it. It's about reminding them of what their self-interest is and getting them to remind each other of what their self-interest is. One of the most effective ways that people have got employers to do stuff in the last decades is like around environmental stuff, LEED certification. And that's not about the government saying you have to do it. That's about other companies saying, well, it's a mark of prestige to have an environmentally nice, useful, safe, whatever the terms are, building, LEED certification. If there was a lead around, are you training your workers? I think that's be the most effective way to get more employers to do it. But it would be making a kind of a branding and marketing and whatever argument, but also a self-interest argument. Yes, let's go.
Hi, my name is Robert. I'm a senior here at the college. I sort of have two questions. The first is, do you think that the disproportionate amount of funding from the federal government for traditional four-year colleges alters the incentives of students who may be better off going to a technical school? And then to put it a different way, should students coming from working class backgrounds who are not academically exceptional be oriented towards job training programs instead of liberal arts programs in which they might not learn the most marketable skills?
Yeah, so good questions. I think the main thing that makes kids who are not going to end up graduating successfully from college go to college is not the money, it's the sort of prestige, and it's the culture. It's every family thinks their kid should go to college, and it helps that there's money for it, but it's not the main thing. And so I think, money is one of the things that you want to change to try to start to change that cultural attitude. The other is what you get at the end. I mean, people want a college degree. More and more, what employers are hiring around, there's a complexity about what employers hire around. Some focus too much on degrees and not enough on skills, but there's a growing movement that's about competencies and what you actually know how to do, and that can be verified with a test that's more like a driver's license test than like a diploma. Like you take for welding or for a lot of things like that, you actually take a performance test administered by a third party that tells you, well, this guy can really well. Doesn't matter where he learned it, and that's true in IT world. The certifications are much more important now for many jobs than the degrees. So some of the ways to think about changing that, for want of a better word, stigma and the cultural things is around money and around the certifications, but it's not just the money right now that's creating the incentives. But I want to kind of take on a little bit, I think you used the phrase, not academically exceptional. I think And this isn't, I don't think, just sort of PC euphemism. I mean, I really do think it's about people learn differently, and some people learn well from what's in a book, looking at a page and thinking about words and thinking about abstractions, and some people just learn better with doing it and experientially. And I don't think it's necessarily, I don't think of them as less. I think of them as different. And I think that there, as somebody on this side of the table pointed out, there's some very valuable jobs that are for people that don't think abstractly and think more kind of practically. And so I'm not trying to be sort of annoyingly PC, but I just think that's an important point to make.
Right, yeah, so I guess what I was aiming at with that, the question was, like, say you have a student who probably learns better with their hands and maybe better suited to become, some sort of trade worker. Do you think that it's in that student's best interest to pursue a trade or go to like a state university and study a liberal arts discipline because of the pressure that we have in our society?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's the argument. You want to keep choices. We don't want tracking, right? You don't want to make kids decide at 12 or 16 or 18, I'm definitely going to be this. And I think, again, everybody kind of knows in this day and age, people have 12 jobs, in coming decades might be even more jobs over their lifetimes. So what you want to do is you want to, as far up the high school and potentially even some post-secondary, you want to train people for both, right? High schools, career-focused high schools say we're going to prepare them for college and for career. And it's about teaching them, your basic reading and math. Sorry, the guy in front of you keeps moving his head. Teaching them same basic basic reading and math. Maybe they get there a different route. Maybe they get there. I mean, I can't tell you the number of young people I've met who say a version of this sentence, which is, I had no interest in math. I was always in the back of the class if I went at all, till I got interested in welding, and then I realized I needed geometry, and then now I'm the best kid in my math class, and there's a lot of that. I mean, part of the career ed is a way to get them into learning some of those other basics, but I think you want to train everybody up to the point that they can later come back to college at some level. But then you also want to teach them these other kind of problem solving and teamwork and job and learning how to learn skills and a technical skill. And then I think what we want to expect of people is that, to think about construction, you graduate from high school and then you go to a post-secondary program that teaches you to be a welder, and that takes 12 weeks, and then you get a pretty good job, making $50K a year as a welder. And maybe you do that for a year or a couple of years, and then maybe by the time you're 25, you decide, well, I actually want to be the foreman. So I'm going to go back to community college and learn how to do some construction management. And then maybe you do that for a while, and then later you decide, well, actually, I want to run the big business, so I'm going to go back and get a 4-year. I mean, I think the goal is, and not everybody will, but you want to keep those avenues open. So it's not about we're going to sort of have, Brave New World, the proles and the sort of, aristocrats. We want to have a world where there's more fluidity and there are more choices and there are more kind of ways up along a lifetime of different kinds of jobs.
I got a question about the meaning of dignity in work. People have spoken of, and you did too, of innovation. Now, Lincoln, this is Abraham Lincoln, gave a speech in 1859 to the Wisconsin State Fair. You probably know this.
I do not know it.
Well, in which he speaks of the American worker, who at that time was mostly a farmer.
Right.
For sure. And I said that the American worker is a special kind of worker because he makes a distinction between doing the job and doing it well. And therefore, the American farmer is not a peasant. So you might find
really
dignity
nice.
in doing the work just as your fathers and their fathers, all the way back to your ancestors, did. And that's a certain fixed status in life,
Right.
Which you live up to and never question.
Right.
But this other way is always trying to do it better. And that way, I noticed that in the people that come to our house, like the electrician that was mentioned, frequently make a habit of disparaging the work that has been done by the people who came before them, and they're proud of this distinction between their work, and also they say, I stand by my work.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, and so the quality of of the work seems to be a factor. And now, too, this also raises another question, which is also was raised about women, men and women, that this attitude towards work, or the dignity of work, seems to demote the dignity of being a parent, and that people leave. I mean, women especially leave the home, and because they look down on the lack of recognition that you get just from being a mother. As Shakespeare said, "Oh, he's his mother's son." The function of a mother is to love her son no matter what.
Yeah.
So
That's
so
interesting.
how do you?
I mean,
and so you got parents versus innovation, and innovation seems to be, and then
Yeah.
parenting or a lack of parenting is one of your problems.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question.
What's the dignity of being a parent in all this?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I don't know that I know the answer. I mean, I love your thing about doing it well, and I think it's true that people who work with their hands and have what they call skill, it is good. That's what skill is about, is doing it well. And you see that a lot. And all of these, the welder, the young man who I was mentioning, who I was actually thinking of, who said it first to me, I wasn't interested in math till I learned it. What he loved about welding was that he was good at it. I mean, I often compare the kids who, I'm coming to parents in a second, but the kids who sort of discover a purpose when they learn a kind of a trade skill or a hands-on skill. It's a little bit like your bar mitzvah. It's the first thing that you do well, and where you kind of get props for doing it well. So I think that's a really good point. And I'm not saying everybody who's a plumber or electrician has that, but I think that's one attribute that maybe we find there. Parenting. I mean, I used to. I mean, I'm of a certain generation, right? And I used to ask people, does your wife work or whatever, and meaning, does she work or does she stay at home? And, you can't ask it that way anymore. Now you have to say, does she work outside the home? Because everybody is sort of giving some recognition to that parenting is also work and something that you do well. I mean,
But work that's drudgery.
well, I don't think our class thinks that. Again, I mean, I would sort of come back to Charles Murray and Putnam, really. I think our class has a different attitude, that raising children is really important and dignified, that maybe not everybody else in society has. I mean, I think that sense of the importance and the dignity of it, and the need to make sacrifices to stay in the two-parent family, I think that's a class divide
The term
to some degree.
homemaking is very interesting.
Yes.
Is homemaking more one parent than the other? Or is it interchangeable?
Well, again, I think in our social milieu, men now think that's part of their role. In working class households, I'm not so sure. I mean, that's a big.
Outside the home, innovation seems good, but
Yeah.
inside it, not so
Maybe
good.
not. Yeah. Others, yes, sir.
I'm Parker Abel. I'm a prior naval officer. I went to the Naval Academy. So my question is basically about earned benefits for education. Obviously, the GI Bill has made a big impact. A lot of my sailors, that wasn't the main reason they served, but that was a huge incentive for them. Of course, I don't know if everybody knows about that, but that applies both to four-year colleges and
Absolutely.
trades.
Yep.
There's been a lot of discussion, like the past 20 years, about increasing that benefit, not just for military service, but also civil service.
Interesting.
What have you looked at in your research, and how is that something that we can look at?
Yeah, great question. I need to look at it a little more. I know that the GI Bill is much more flexible and usable, and it's kind of a general model of mine, but I haven't really looked at it carefully. But I think that's a really good idea. I mean, yes, I'm gonna take that home and look at it.
There was a retired general who spoke on the floor of the House, I don't want to say recently, but 10 years ago, about a whole plan basically proposing, hey, you go and do civil service jobs, even if it's cleaning a military base that we currently outsource, and it's a 2-for-4 kind
Yeah.
of situation.
Yeah.
So it's more of an earned benefit rather than I breathe, I get A's, I go to college.
Yeah, no, I like that. I mean, there's a lot of focus. So somebody used the what we jokingly call in my business the A word, apprenticeship term. And, the idea of apprenticeship is that you go to school and you work both. And that's been, I think, if you're apprenticeship, for many people, any kind of job training, the sort of the version of it they understand is apprenticeship. And apprenticeship is kind of the point about the reason I'm bringing it up now is that it is, you do work half the time, and then that work often helps pay for your education, or people think they should be related, or and so and the idea that it's not quite the same because you're not exactly earning the tuition free, but you are earning and you are having a sense of your purpose. And there's a lot of people, I mean, I think everyone in the sort of training workforce career ed world agrees that that's the ideal mix, is some class and some practical hands-on where you have a sense of responsibility and you're actually doing the job. I think there's been a little bit of fetishizing of apprenticeship by both the Obama administration and the Trump administration as the only word they use when they talk about training. And the reason I think that's a problem is that apprenticeships are mostly like 3 and 4 years, and therefore it only works at companies that are willing to pay quite a bit of money to make the apprenticeship work. And I think the principles of apprenticeship can be applied to much simpler kind of versions. I mean, I sort of think apprenticeship is kind of like the Maserati. If we could all buy Maseratis, we would all buy apprenticeship, but not everybody can buy a Maserati, and there ought to be sort of Model T versions that incorporate those principles of you learn on the job and you learn in class, and the employer and the educator partner, and maybe the trainee gets paid some, but you ought to be able to do it for 3 weeks and not just 3 years. And so apprenticeship's a big topic, but that's sort of thumbnail. 2 cents on apprenticeship. Yes, you've asked one, so maybe you haven't asked yet.
Yeah, I wondered sort of 2 things. The first one is how scalable are these programs? So, you described some programs that sound really great and benefit a lot of people, but how much are you going to be able to capture of the working class who are sort of struggling in these programs? Both as a limitation on the number of employers who are willing to participate and have jobs available that they want to fill, and then also in terms of the willingness of people to take up these programs, because it seems like there's always going to be the 40-year-old guy who's unmarried and staying at home who can just go on disability, and that because of wages is a much more attractive opportunity for him. And then my other question is, I understand it's very hard to get people sort of back into the workforce after they've become a discouraged worker, or after they've left the labor force, to get them to re-enter. And it seems like the main incentive that often might get people back in is, at least at a certain income level or a certain wealth level, the necessity of money, but they'll also get the benefit of dignity, the benefits of prestige, but that's not what's going to kick them in. But that's something that they will start sort of earning or benefiting from in 3 or 4 months down the road. And so how do you capitalize on the non-economic benefits of re-entering?
Yeah, good. So 2 good questions. Scalability, I mean, again, sort of career education in general, post-secondary, secondary, adult workers is, sort of the new black or whatever, the new it girl all around the country. And is it getting better? Is it growing? What are the limits to the growth? Hard to say. But, lots of, I mean, for example, high school CTE, they call it, career and technical education, and it goes to what I was talking about a minute ago of kids get interested. It's a way into academics. Graduation rates are much better for people who do CTE. Like high schools that have CTE programs, people who do more than one course are much more likely to graduate than the general high school population, or significantly more. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity. Again, don't think of it as 2 tracks. Think of it as, like, every kid needs more career exposure, right? My niece, who graduated from an Ivy League college with, the best education in America, when I sat down with her as she graduated, I said, so what's next, Jane? And she said, well, I can't decide. Am I going to go on in Chinese or math? And I said, Jane, that's not the choice. The choice is, do you want to work in an office? Do you want to work with people? Do you want to work inside? Do you want to work outside? And I'm not suggesting welding. I'm just saying, give more thought to what really are your options. So I think career exposure, various kinds of career education, I think there's a lot of growth potential. How many welding programs do we need? Another question. But, I think we need a lot of tech. A lot of people want to be tech work in IT, and they're going to need to be a lot of programs for them, and some of them need bachelor's degrees and some of them don't. So I think there's a lot of, I don't think we're at the end of the scale yet, scaling yet. Getting discouraged workers back into the workforce, that's a really good term I hadn't used in a while, is really hard. I mean, that's the biggest challenge. You know, we know how to make good high school CTE programs. We pretty much know now how to make good post-secondary CTE programs at community college. Those people who lost their job and don't, you know, it is about, I mean, I've spent time trying to meet them and talk to them and think about it, and it does have a lot to do with age, about how likely they are to get back into the workforce seriously. But some of them you do just feel they're sort of broken, and it's really going to be hard. You know, I think the more we can show them opportunity, the more we can, I'm sort of for things like wage insurance is something that people think about, where, like, let's say you lose your $25 an hour job and you have to take a $9 an hour job. Maybe for a few years the government pays part of the difference so that at least you stay in the workforce and don't get out of the workforce totally. And maybe you would add to that a requirement that you train in that time, so the hope that you would then get a better job. I mean, I think policy has to think about how do we help those people, and how do we make sure that the appeal of the benefits isn't more than the appeal of the potential jobs. I mean, that's the cliff problem. And we do have a proposal in here, which I don't talk about that much, for, you know, EITC subsidizes paychecks, and we grow the EITC, and we subsidize paychecks. There's a lot of things in here. You know, there's some role for that, but I think we do have to be careful that it's tied to working. Yes, let's see no, I'm still looking for people who haven't asked a question. Then I'm going to come back to you two who have. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I'm Reg, and I liked your talk. I keep hearing, in recent months and years, I've heard this statistic about how aren't we the only OECD country where life expectancy for the last 3 years has been in decline? So I'd be happy if you could work this into your presentation in a sharp way,
Yes.
because it's a
Yes. Yeah. No.
if it's accurate, it's
Yes,
a
Reggie, you and I are working to raise the average.
Yes. So deaths of despair. Suddenly blanking. Ann Case and her husband, I'm forgetting, from Princeton, who did this research. Ann Case and Deaton.
and Deaton.
Deaton. Well, I'll forget his first
Princeton.
name. Yeah. They. So Ann Case was one of the people who quit our group. Just for the record, so she was in our 16 and she left.
In your group.
In our group.
Angus
and
Deaton,
Ann Case was just, you know, it's gossip. It's not really relevant. But deaths of despair. This notion of the deaths of despair was quite a bit what we were kind of thinking about. And you know, this is the working class that's not now working and is. It's the opioid epidemic, and it's generally despair. I mean, the deaths of despair are about alcohol, opioids, and suicide, and that was part of what kind of focused us. And you're right, I should mention it. But and we don't have answers really. We have some answers on opioids. You know, I mean, I think our answers work, and you know, and opioids. You know, the question about opioids is, I mean, opioids. It's a very complicated problem, and I'm not an expert. But you know, it was a thing where people there was this mistake in marketing of the legit, you know, marketable, whatever they're called, the legitimate marketable drugs. I mean, people said that Oxycontin, whatever it's called. I'm sorry, I'm going to get all the terms wrong. But people said that this medication that was being marketed, the industry said it's not addictive, and doctors were encouraged to prescribe it, you know, very liberally, and they did prescribe it very liberally, and a lot of people got addicted. And then what happened was that the companies started to realize that, and the government started to realize that, and the supply of that kind of legal medication got cut very dramatically. And at that very same time, the cartels figured out, well, there's a lot of addicted people that we could be selling to, and illegal and synthetic drugs came in and filled the need that had been created by this overuse of prescription medication. And so the opioid epidemic is a sort of a complicated phenomenon that the question is going to be, what's its life going to be? How long is it going to run, and what's going to happen to it? And I think, my sort of understanding of it is that it came into places where people didn't have jobs anymore, and the society was crumbling. It's this back to this interaction of what's the society, what's the economics, and what's the sort of accidents like the opioid epidemic. And so the big question for me is like how people are seeing a leveling off of opioid use and deaths. How does that mean it's temporary leveling off? Does that mean it is going to kind of run its course? That's one kind of problem that has to be addressed, the opioids in particular. But I think some of the other stuff we're talking about, which is getting people back into the workforce and creating stable families and creating alternatives to community, that's as important as what's the answer for the opioids. And we have some suggestions about the opioids, but I don't think they're major suggestions, if that makes sense. Yes. Okay, we're coming back to the people who've asked questions already. A new person who hasn't spoken. Yes, sir. Too new.
Step back for a moment. It sounds like something like this has been going on forever. When this country started, 97% of the people were working in agriculture, and now it's 3%. My numbers may be off, but the trend is clear. I wonder if there were all these groups involved and government involved back 100, 150 years ago, there'd be all sorts of angst and efforts. How are we going to get the people back to the farms? Because we're losing all these jobs there. You had a slide earlier. I don't remember the number, but I think it was over $400 billion that the government has spent.
140.
Oh, I'm sorry?
140. Still a lot.
140 billion. I just wonder whether they just put the money back in the hands of the people, got out of the way, whether it would be an improvement. You mentioned about how companies should understand that if they have well-trained workers, it's in their interest. I find it hard to believe that most companies don't know that. Those that don't will lose market share. That you said that customers should like them. The companies that don't figure that out will get hurt. You go back, 110 years ago, Henry Ford's famous comment, you can have any color, any model you want, as long as it's black.
Right.
He made that comment, and Ford lost dramatic amount of market share. So I guess my question is, the academic interest I can understand is useful and probably helpful to the companies. The government involvement, taxing the rest of us to support these programs that will somehow be developed, reminds me of the central planning of the Soviet Union, how we can run the economy and figure out what the process should be. Wonder if we'd be better off with the imperfections of the marketplace solving this rather than the more serious imperfections.
Yeah, no, so I'm definitely with you. I like markets solving things too. I'm 100% with you in theory on that. Right now we have a very skewed market, because if I get my Pell Grant, I can't spend my Pell Grant wherever I want. Where can I spend my Pell Grant? It has to be an accredited institution of higher learning. I have to be learning on the credit side of the house, which doesn't mean anything here, but at community colleges, half the kids are on the non-credit side of the house, and the non-credit programs are much better at partnering with employers to come up with a good workforce training, and it has to be 16 weeks long. 16 credit hours. And so the market is already very skewed. And basically what I'm asking is for an unskewing of the market. If the government's going to subsidize post-secondary training, I mean, we could get out of that business entirely. I don't know what I think about that. I'm not going that far. But I want to level the playing field so that it is much more of a market-driven thing. And if you wanted to use your Pell to come to Harvard, you could. But if you wanted to use your Pell to learn welding at the company, you could do that too.
Notice here's a government grant that skews the wrong way. It's exactly the problem.
Exactly.
And now, would we be better off with the government not giving out Pell Grants and letting the money stay in the pockets of the citizenry?
Well, but I mean, I don't know. So again, I'm not sure I'm for abolishing federal financial aid for poor kids, because, you know, post-secondary school is expensive, and that is a way to do some leveling of the playing field. I think you should have much more market choice within federal financial aid. I'm not yet to maybe I'll get there, but I haven't gotten to abolishing federal financial aid yet.
More expensive because of the government.
Well, and there's where you have to rejigger it, right? It has to be much more performance-based, and everybody has to have skin in the game. So the programs I like are there's a great program in Virginia, now we're getting sort of techie, but, in the weeds, but where the kids pay a third, the school pays a third, and the state pays a third. And when you get, and if the kid doesn't do well, it's the kid on the hook and then the school on the hook. And that is going to keep the level of the prices down. I mean, Bill Bennett was right. You give people aid for something, the price goes up. So we want to try to limit that, and we want to try to make sure that that outcomes make a difference. And it can't just be outcomes you graduate. It's outcomes, do you get a job, do you earn a better wage? So the programs have to be redesigned. I'm not prepared to go yet. Again, maybe I'll go get more radical and with the years. But I'm not yet prepared to go to just leave it alone. But I think the program should be redesigned. A couple of you over there have second questions.
I'm persuaded that, as he suggests, the federal government got into it. That certainly fueled the loan crisis. Certainly talk of eliminating all loans is making it worse, drove up the cost of education. Did you have any suggestions on that in your program? And then I also wanted to know, is anybody listening to you and with hands on the policy levers and doing something about the various suggestions?
We're working on that. So we're working on the policy levers. This is the kind of story you brag about in Washington. I don't like bragging, and it's kind of silly. I'm not sure it's a brag or something embarrassing, but somebody in the Trump administration, the guy who's the deputy chief of staff for policy, David Brooks wrote a column about us, glowing column. And who knew that anybody in the Trump administration read the New York Times? Who knew that anybody in the Trump administration read David Brooks? And who knew that anybody in the Trump administration read through the first three paragraphs of a David Brooks column that said, the Trump administration is awful, but in the meantime, some people have ideas. Anyway, somebody read it and somebody called us in. So we did have a meeting with Ivanka and Kevin Hassett, and they agree with a lot of stuff, including level the playing field on Pell. Whether they'll do it, whether I want them to be my champions, whether anybody else in Washington will listen if it becomes their idea, those are all a lot of unanswered questions. But we got some interest from them. And we've had quite a bit of interest from both sides of the aisle in Congress. We're trying to take that a step further than just interest. We're trying to actually get some people, build some little coalitions behind some of the ideas. We haven't done it yet. But I also am trying to get out to governors. A lot of the ideas are for governors. So we didn't just print this up and throw it out. We are trying to build some support around the ideas.
So really we have to
stop.
And
right.
We want to thank you for all these wise words from Washington.
Well, I don't know about that. Thank you so much.